The following is a presentation of Tuning into Sci-Fi TV, the viewer's guide to genre television.
Everyone, welcome to a bonus podcast for Game of Thrones Season 5. The saga continues. I am Wendy Hembrock, and I am joined by most of the small council. Introduce yourselves, please, gentlemen.
Hey, this is Shannon from Vancouver, Washington, and I am the master of Hoopleheads.
And I am Jesse Jackson from Dallas, Texas, and I am the master of digression and patience.
And this is Lou Sytsma from St. Albert, Alberta, Canada. And this week I'm not a master, but I am a disciple of Gil and Itamar.
Ah.
Yes, the Maesters of History.
That's right.
Which is what our special bonus podcast is going to be about. I had mentioned several times that I go scanning all around YouTube to find bonus content for our show. So we'll be doing a little bit of discussion about some recent news, but for the most part, we're going to talk about some YouTube videos on specific topics from the Game of Thrones Academy. And I'll explain that a little bit more, but basically, there's lots of interesting parallels between real history that we might glean about where the story could be going, which is what we're going to talk about primarily in this podcast. But before we do that, I just want to point out a couple of links that are kind of cool. One is these very fun posters of the Game of Thrones characters, sort of as if they were sort of high school characters. I liked them. I thought they were clever, and I always like when fans sort of run with the ball on characterization, so those were kind of cool. We also had some big casting news come out. First of all, Ian McShane will be joining Game of Thrones. Most people might think of him from Deadwood, but he's been in a gazillion things. And also, the role of the Three-Eyed Raven has been recast with Max von Sydow playing the part, which is really awesome news.
Yeah, hence my reference to Hoopleheads in the beginning. I'm very excited about Ian McShane. Deadwood is in my top 5 shows of all time. I love that. I thought it was gritty, dirty, Shakespearean, operatic, and fantastically written and acted. And I could watch Ian McShane in just about anything. I think he's doing a stint on Ray Donovan right now. So I know Wendy and I and some of the other folks were speculating on Twitter about who he might play. They did release the information with Max von Sydow on his role, but they have not specified who McShane is playing, except to say that it might be a smaller role, but it's a pivotal role. So the things that came to my mind and that I heard speculation would be a Greyjoy. There are 2 that we have not met, and then there's the possibility that they could combine those into a new character to do some consolidation. There's also the possibility of Sam Tarley's dad. We know they're going to be visiting there from the storylines and from some of the scouting locations. And then I also heard there's the potential of doing a flashback that might get into the R+L=J. And he could be a compatriot or a contemporary of Robert and Ned at the time. And a lot of folks thought that it might be a character named Arthur Dane. So those are the top three possibilities that had surfaced for McShane. But both of those casting is just fantastic.
Yeah, I loved all the artwork and very, very creative, very different. So I liked it a lot. You know, I'm also a big fan of McShane and Max van Sweden. Any chance that they will recast Theon's father? I don't know. Is his father have a big part in, the parts of the books we haven't seen so far? Because they're recasting this, Max van Syden is taking a different, what was played by someone else. So just kind of throwing it out there, and you book readers could share with me.
Well, he's just to quickly jump in to answer your question. There was one of the few subplots that was left out. There's a thing called a king's moot, which is the method for determining succession in the Iron Islands, because in the novels, Theon's father is not alive anymore, whereas he is on the show. So we have yet to see the effects of that final leech. So I imagine if he's there, they would keep that character rather than recast him, and he would be one of the Greyjoy brothers, like Theon's uncles. So that's the speculation. And I haven't heard about, is it Patrick Malahide, I guess, played his father? I haven't heard about him being recast or not returning. So who knows?
Okay. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And, it's hard to believe, right, that we're still talking about this show how many weeks after it's gone off the air, but it's just we don't want to let it go, right?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you can sign on talent like Ian McShane and Max von Sydow is, it's just, I think the show is in a very enviable position at this time. I think they could probably almost get anybody to come on the show, really, if they asked them. Or anybody would want to come on the show. I mean, if they get Daniel Day-Lewis to ever come on the show, then I'm just really gonna have a conniption.
Oh my God, that's a great one.
But because he hasn't done anything lately, so it's like, come on, Daniel, let's go take even a guest role. But I really hope they give McShane a particularly juicy role, maybe something as an offset to like what Diana Rigg has done with Oleana Tyrell. I want him to be really sharp with the dialogue, and maybe their aim is to upset people with swearing next season instead of sexual situations.
Yeah,
they're going to up their game on cussing.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I feel, in a way, Mark Gatiss, right, didn't get to do much, and maybe he'll be a bigger part later. But, yeah, you hope that they don't, and I hate to use the word waste, but they use this character, the actors, in the fullest way.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming, similar to Kieran Hines, he wasn't in a lot, but he played a really important character who affected a lot of other people. So I would be fine if he has that much weight in terms of importance, if not screen time.
Absolutely.
But I was thinking about some of Shannon's ideas. A Greyjoy, I hate the Greyjoy, so I don't really want him to be on Team Greyjoy.
Never trust the Greyjoy.
I think we should have sort of know nothing actors I don't care about can be Greyjoys. But I really like the idea of him playing Sam Charlie's father, because that is such an opposite kind of a person to Sam. And I think there'd just be some really interesting stuff going on between those characters. I don't think it's Arthur Dane, because I was reading in other places that like the key criteria for that character casting was to be an expert swordsman. So I think he's actually going to be his young age or younger was the way I read that. But who knows? They can do anything in a flashback, right?
And the other thing too, I can't remember if Arthur Dane has passed or is still around. And if he's still around, it could be going to revisit him, and he's older now, which would fit McShane, and it probably wouldn't require him to do a lot of sword slinging.
If I remember from the Westeros history book, Ned actually killed him because he was the one who had that sword called Something Special that I don't remember the name, but Ned made a point to return the sword to his family after the war ended. That's the story I remember.
He did die at the Tower of Joy.
Yeah, I thought so.
Okay.
So he can't be him now, like old Arthur Dane.
Right.
And
he would seem to be a little old for a flashback too, because I think he's a little bit older.
He's older than
Sean
Ned
Bean.
would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. He's like a Tywin age character, I would think.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about Game of Thrones Academy. And before we jump in, I want to explain who these guys are. And definitely, please follow the link in the show notes because they're fascinating to watch as they have these discussions. But basically, these two guys who are, I will call them Game of Thrones super fans, Gil Kidron, I think is how his name is pronounced, and Itamar Harel are two guys living in Israel who are history buffs by education. Itamar is a history and biblical studies teacher currently, and Gil is a blogger. And they started to want to discuss Game of Thrones in the context of the actual history of the Middle Ages, because George R.R. Martin has said that was the period that inspired the story. The War of the Roses definitely influenced some of the ideas and some of the characters that are in Game of Thrones. And so that's what they're doing in these videos that are filmed in, I think it's Itamar's apartment. And there's a notable cat named Sophie who appears.
Love the kitty.
Yes, she's very expressive. If you check the link in the show notes, you'll see the links to their YouTube page with all the different topics. You'll also see some photographs of the two hosts and the cat. So check that out if you can. So the first one that we want to talk about is talking about Old Valyria. And they kind of do a comparison with the Roman Empire as the context for, I'll say, what's the analog to Old Valyria. And again, the story from their view of history is that, the whole Game of Thrones world is set in the Middle Ages. Primarily Western Europe is sort of the center of the universe and the point of view. And the idea that, Valyria at the time of the Middle Ages, or the time of the Game of Thrones Middle Ages, would be equivalent to in the 15th century how, the Roman Empire was not really well understood. This was things that had happened 1,000 years ago. So there was technology, there was engineering achievements that seem to be beyond what is capable of the people in the current time frame. So in present Westeros, and also in terms of the government at that time, Valyria considered itself a freehold, even though they kept slaves of other people. So, hypocrisy runs deep. But they had a military, they had an infrastructure that was superior, and they had dragons, which was, in their analog, like technology. The dragons were like having weapons of mass destruction or nukes for their time period. And the view for Valyria is that everything outside is barbarians and lots of slaveholders who they considered worse, more brutal than they themselves were. So before Valyria, there was also an even more old empire called Giscari, which is where Meereen and Slaver's Bay came from. And Gil and Itamar equate that to Carthage, if you think about what was the empire that existed before the Roman Empire. But I think even in the show, one of the very visual parallels that I think is established is when they actually go to Old Valyria this season, and we see what looks like kind of an aqueduct that's sort of fallen apart, which definitely was a hallmark of the Romans. And they also talk about how there's a little bit of ancient Greece in there. But Valyria, from a map point of view, they say it looks like Italy got blown up. And they use the equivalent of the doom of Valyria with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii. So lots of interesting ideas in there, but I want to let you guys comment on things that jumped out at you as well.
That's one of the things that made Game of Thrones so attractive to me when I first started reading the books, and then also in the way that the show has adapted them, is George R. R. Martin took things that are plausible because they actually happened, whether it's the War of the Roses or ancient Rome or what have you, and then adapted them into the world of Westeros so that if you think, well, this is just a fantasy trope or whatever, you could say, well, no, this happened through history, and there were lines of succession, and there were incest, and there were fights for the crown, and there was slavery, and there were civil wars, and there were all these things. And then over the course of the novels, of course, he starts lacing in things like dragons and blood magic and White Walkers and whatnot. So, but you're in a completely grounded, completely believable world. And what's fascinating about these videos is that they look at some of those analogs and or inspirations or things that George R. R. Martin has kind of done a mashup on to create the world of Westeros. I then look at him and say, okay, well, here's the way the real life things played out. And based upon what we know of all these influences, they have a really good discussion about what's going to happen on the show. And then at the end of each, or at least most of the videos, they make some kind of fearless prediction for that topic based on what happened in real history. So, and then the other thing they mention that I think George R. R. Martin has also talked about, you know, Wendy, you mentioned obviously Rome and the doom of Valyria, the inspiration being Vesuvius, but there's also a little bit of Atlantis because, you know, it's the lost continent and there's no real history of Atlantis. And people have said, historians, well, it could be this, it could be that. But in genre hands, Atlantis almost always takes on some kind of magical, mystical quality. And, you know, according to the Maesters, part of what happened in the Doom of Valyria, depending upon whose tales you believe, they were tapping into more and more magic, and it became unstable. And that's also where dragon eggs came from and a lot of the that culture. So you get a little bit of Atlantis, you get a little bit of Roman Empire, and different influences, and it's pretty fascinating. Also, one thing I would point out, if you're watching those videos, they do talk briefly about a plot from the books, which has not yet surfaced on the TV show. And I don't know if they're going to tackle this or not. I think if they were going to weave this story in, they may have done it by now. But with the talk coming out of the TCA convention last week that it looks like we're heading for 8 seasons versus 7, so 3 more, maybe they will find time to weave that in. But if you don't want to be spoiled on the books, they do reference a plot about another possible claimant to the throne.
You know, one of the things I found pretty interesting about this is early in my science fiction life, I was a big fan of Isaac Asimov, and I still am. And his Foundation series was him retelling the decline of the Roman Empire, right? And so there's a long tradition of taking, you know, history and changing it up and creating a new world. What I find fascinating, and I had a little trouble, I shared this with the small council. At first, you know, it gave me tired head, as we say here in Dallas when we're listening to the sports station we listen to. You know, but the more I started listening to them, and understanding their cadence and understanding kind of the, their pattern, I guess is the wrong word, but kind of the kind of agenda they're doing in the format, the more I started being fascinated by these two fans that are exploring the books and the show in a different way. And so I just think this is really an interesting, and it's one of those things, you don't need to have this to enjoy the series, but it's an added layer and just some added depth that kind of helps you see, and especially I think with a rewatch, you'll go, oh, I see what you did there.
Yeah, this video of old Valeria's the Roman Empire. Shannon said a lot of things I agree with. But it's one of those double-edged sword things, because on the one hand, you're going, oh, this is really cool that I can see that this piece of this Game of Thrones story really does have a corollary in history. So you can see kind of the seams where George R.R. Martin must have done a lot of research and took real historical events and used them for his purposes in his Game of Thrones stories. But it's still a massive amount of research, I'm sure, that he did, and backstory building that he did. But some of the parallels are pretty clear. I think my favorite thing was Itamar, his big bold prediction was that the Iron Throne will fall, which we've said as well in our podcast. So it's an interesting perspective, and maybe because they're European or over across the ocean, their perspective on things are slightly different than ours. I think they have more. I think they have more sense of history. As I watch more of their videos, I think they have more sense of history of that, specifically of that part of the world. So they're seeing this show through a slightly different viewpoint, which I found quite fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Itamar in particular, that's his area of history, focus area. Although Gil's no slouch when it comes to history, which a lot of people, I don't perceive them as sort of trying to map things and force fit to say this is where the story's going. But I think what they're doing is saying there's ideas that keep recurring in history, and they often recur in literature. And I think those are sort of the elements that they really want to discuss, because they capture our imagination in a certain way. They talked a lot about, the ideas of the Roman Empire and how they take some examples that are very specific, like in the histories, the Valyrians destroyed the Giscari by sowing salt, and the Romans did that against Carthage, kind of stuff. So, and I don't know that it's necessarily the point that they did something so similar, but it creates a lot of information for us in a very quick way, telling us about the culture. Because the other thing that they talked about a little bit in this video was Aegon the Conqueror. He came from Valyria. And when he got to Westeros, he brought that sort of political perspective with him. So he was not really a European, just like the Romans are more Mediterranean than European. But they've left this long legacy of culture, both Greek and Roman, in terms of language, the law, a lot of infrastructure ideas, a lot of ideas about how the state should be run that have lingered in Westeros since then. So one of the things that they included in the bold prediction was that there'll be a revival, a rebirth of the Valyrian culture, the Valyrian ideals, which, fits with the view that Dany is the one who's going to rise and sort of be symbolically a lot of those Valyrian ideals. And, if we continue with the Jon Snow is Jon Targaryen, he comes with some different ideas too. He's the one who is saying, look, we got to bring the wildlings into the fold, which is kind of crazy talk. It's what got him killed or stabbed, for instance. So it's kind of, I thought it was very interesting how they were drawing the parallels of how these characters, not directly, they're not flying the banner necessarily that they're restoring old Valyria, because they're not. Dany is freeing all the slaves, which definitely wasn't old Valyria. They had slaves. But they had less slaves relative to the free cities did, for instance. So the thing that I found interesting was also talking about what happened after the Middle Ages. It was the Renaissance. So we had talked about there's going to be revolution, and they are pretty much agreeing with that if we look at actual history that's comparable to the time.
Yeah, you make a good point about, if people assume that Dany may wind up, or hope that Dany may wind up as the eventual winner, if you will, of the Game of Thrones, she comes from that heritage, but she was cut off from a lot of it. She had to learn it second and third hand, and they've never discussed it explicitly, but you could probably guess that Tyrion knows more about her heritage and culture than she does. So a lot of it would depend upon if he's an advisor, and if he thinks that that's a good way to imbue the foundation of a new government or a new ruling class. There, Tyrion is also somebody who would be in favor of an expansion of the arts and creativity and a lot of the things that they talked about. If it's Jon Snow, there's a different set of values there. One thing that also resulted in ancient Rome that they did was they had a ruling body known as a triumvirate. There were three. And so when you think about three heads of the dragon and some of the prophecies, and our three characters that a lot of people have said maybe three heads of the dragon, Dany, Tyrion, and Jon Snow, if he's alive or resurrected or in a dog or whatever, that those three characters could wind up taking a page from the Roman Empire and ruling as a triumvirate. There are a lot of possibilities that still draw upon that history.
Yeah, we tend to think, it's kind of funny while I was listening to you talk, Wendy and Shannon, is that we tend to think that, Dany's going to end up being, the winner, if we're going to have a winner, if anyone survives. And we have talked a lot about in this series, in our discussions, that we don't know if she necessarily will be a very good leader. So I'm kind of curious to see how this does and what they're going to do, and how much will we follow the history, and how much will George R.R. Martin go on his own path and kind of do, and give us an ending that he wants to give us.
Well, the other thing that was interesting that we mentioned. Dany's got the dragons and she's got the Valyrian blood, but part of the fall of old Valyria was over-reliance on technology to rule versus being good rulers. And I like the idea a lot of having this sort of triumvirate, or who knows, parliament, or, representative government or something, really crazy like that coming, because clearly the feudalism way of choosing your leaders doesn't really play out for the people, the lowly plebeian people. And, we've definitely gotten a lot of rumblings about, the Faith of the Seven represent the free people. The wildlings come with a completely different idea about, what their inherent rights are. And, they don't believe in liege lords and all that stuff. They followed Mance Rayder because he was persuasive and compelling, and he got their interests in alignment, which sounds like something a Varys and a Tyrion could sell. I don't know about Dany. Dany might be good at the conquering, but not the good at the ruling part. Same with Jon Snow. He might be good at the solving the immediate war problem, the immediate conflict, but might not turn out to be that great of a governor, good at the governance part too. So lots of really compelling ideas coming out of there. And there's more that we didn't talk about too. So totally encourage folks to listen to them talk in their own words about it. The other one that was pretty cool that I wanted to spend time talking about is dragons. And in their discussion about dragons, they talk again about, parallels to reality, which in reality there's no dragons, but there's plenty of, mythology about dragons in our current history. They were considered, harbingers of magic. They're fire turned into flesh. In the story, they have a connection to the volcanoes around Valyria. The Valyrians learned out how to have some connection with them and train them, and were able to manipulate them. They were used as, a weapon of mass destruction, probably psychological intimidation too. But controlling a dragon, very dicey, right? They can be used for exerting compliance over people. But they're very dangerous, and, they're not predictable. And we've already seen those, ideas planted in the story about how Dany didn't really have control over Drogon, and Jorah had warned her, look, I don't really think you can, control these things to the level that makes them safe. They're never really going to be safe. So there's also historical lore, though, from literature, especially during the Middle Ages, that, dragons lived in caves. They were something that the hero had to overcome. Beowulf is one of the oldest stories we have, and it's about slaying a dragon to get to the treasure that's being guarded. Or, St. George saved the city that was plagued by a dragon and turned them into Christians at the end of it. And, the Chinese have dragon lore. It's a little bit different. So do the Vikings. So the interesting thing in here was, I think everyone who watches Game of Thrones really likes the dragons. And these guys argue that, dragons are loose nukes, and they can't really be long lasting. They have to be sort of transitory, and otherwise they create a problem that might be even worse, if you can imagine, than your White Walker problem. So it's interesting because the story up to this point, we kind of associate the dragons mostly positively. Yep, they did, Drogon did burn up a little girl, and Dany did use them for terror when she was trying to interrogate who was behind the Harpies insurgency. But we haven't seen them sort of be that much of a problem yet. So I liked a lot about the idea that these are a very double-edged sword, can easily escalate out of control too. And that the last time, Aegon was able to establish his legacy, for about 150 years. But again, they sort of couldn't sustain it just with having dragons. But they did have that interbreeding problem too.
Yeah, the downfall of that is kind of interesting because it also looked at a problem with, knowing how to rule, which we talked about in that previous topic. Would a Danny or whomever actually winds up winning be as good at ruling and healing the country as they were at conquering? I mean, that was part of Robert's problem. And, well, virtually all of the people that have ruled Westeros in the last few hundred years is they could conquer, but they, for the most part, with a few exceptions, were terrible rulers. So you'll also have, we don't know right now if there are more than those three. We know that, or think that those are the only three that are alive and out and about. But are there more eggs hidden in the depths of old Valeria? Or are there more eggs out there like the ones that were given to Dany for her wedding that could eventually hatch? What are the reproductive possibilities of Dany's three? Are they asexual? Do they need to have sex? Do they lay eggs? We don't know any of that. So, and if there are, I think the video makes a point is like, yes, they would be useful and maybe they could be controlled for a certain period of time, but they eventually would become a problem. And that's the other thing, is that even in old Valyria and the early Targaryens and whatnot, they learned through a lot of trial and error and being burned up and killed, eventually how to exercise a modicum of control over the dragons. But if more start popping up, that knowledge has been lost to history. We've seen Dany try to learn on the fly with it. But if suddenly there are more, then it's like you were talking about, Wendy, there are loose nukes everywhere and nobody with any idea how to control them, how to implement them, how to do anything. So it's they're fascinating. We love to see them. They have personalities. They look fantastic on screen. But in the course of the story, it is going to be something we have to deal with.
Yeah, we love the idea that Dany has dragons, right? She's fighting the good fight. She's saving, she's freeing slaves. She's the conqueror. And then we see, a season or so ago, things turn to a little darker. And, the first time we saw them, one of the dragons kill a lamb, right? A sheep. I thought it was a kid, and then later it was a child. And so you be careful what you wish for, right? And I do think that, also calling it the nuclear option, the downside in the Cold War, I guess the difference of the Cold War is, in the Cold War, both sides had these horrible weapons pointing at each other. But in this one, you only one side has him, but they just as easily could have turned on you as it is your enemies. So, she was very smart in using them this season, but as we talked about it, she was worried and she was concerned about what's going to happen. So, she's walking a very narrow, dangerous path. We have one free, two in captivity, and the one free, is injured, trying to, hey, Mom, let me sleep. I'm trying to get better. And, where is she going to be and what's she going to do? So I thought this was fascinating, and especially how they were able to take mythical beasts that are real in the show and, tie it together.
Yeah, it's this video for me probably raised the most interesting questions or trains of thought that or sparked just a lot of different things that I hadn't really thought of properly until I saw that. But because the dragons are presented as this concept of a sort of a doomsday device. It's interesting that it shows that out of everything that George has done in creating Game of Thrones, he really does have an excellent grasp of magical systems, and he understands the dangers of introducing them into his world, because he's really put a lot of checks and balances in for the dragons. They are very fierce, and in conventional warfare situations, they can rout armies. The problem that, as Jesse mentioned, as we've seen, however, is that they're not really that stable. It's kind of like an unstable isotope. Daenerys' control of Drogon is tenuous at best, and that makes for interesting storytelling, because if she had those dragons walking around behind her like a trained poodles or something like that, there wouldn't be much tension about what's going to go potentially could happen in the story. So I really do like that aspect of it. And when I was first listening to them talk about this in the video, I wasn't really convinced it was an arms race situation. But then I realized that, and this is where I have my big dilemma, is that their hypothesis is that at some point the dragons have to go, but we have the problem of the walkers, and it's basically fire versus ice, which is what the story is all about in one sense. So you really can't let the dragons go until you know that you've resolved for a safe period of time that the North is not going to be overrun by these ice creatures or whatnot. So I don't really know if they can let the dragons go that quickly. But controlling them also is going to be is very difficult. So I'm not really sure how this is going to play out. And because of that, I'm not totally sold on their belief that at some point the dragons are going to have to go. I mean, how long do you keep them around? How long are you sure that the walkers are not going to come invading if they go into hibernation or something like that? And you have to get to a point where you have to be pretty sure that I guess the head of the house is cut off, and I don't know if that will. It's like if you kill the queen bee and then the rest of the white walkers or whatnot, and whites are going to sort of become aimless and not nearly the same amount of threat. So I'm not sure how this is going to play out, and I'm looking forward to see how George Martin is going to resolve this conflict of the dragons versus the walkers.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be more complicated than that. I don't think the dragons are the only tool in the toolkit, right? We know that they can be used to forge Valyrian steel, if somebody could remember how to make a Valyrian steel sword, right? So hopefully Sam Tarley was going to get to the Citadel and find some cookbooks on that. But as Jesse said, the balance of power is off. Dany, because she can control dragons, is that the justification for you to be a ruler? I mean, she's not very good at it, right? Or she hasn't been up to this point. And as you were talking, Lou, I was actually thinking that, maybe the story is, Dany helps lead, the possible battle on one front against the White Walkers, and maybe Jon Snow's got some other, as well as Brandon with his super warging powers. Because when we were thinking about who else could influence a dragon, Brandon comes to mind as my number 2 guy on that list, if he could warg into one and control it. But there's a couple possibilities. One is, what if those 2 dragons escape, or somebody who is against Dany's regime lets them out, right? Because then you got chaos in Meereen. If, Dany's gone, who is ostensibly the only person who can control these dragons, and now they're terrorizing the countryside, which would really effectively undermine the legitimacy of Tyrion and Varys ruling. So they could fly off. I think there's been speculation that dragons could be hermaphrodite and switch sexes. So those two dragons could get busy down there and start creating more, possibly. But I was thinking, assuming that Dany does somehow use Drogon and the other dragons to stop the White Walkers, that might not be what she wants to do next, is rule the Iron Throne. Maybe she, similar to, I think, the Lord of the Rings, right? They won, but the price was they had to leave. And maybe the price is Dany's going to have to take those dragons to some volcanoes, and maybe she's going to have to go into old Valyria and sort of hang out and keep them contained there, or isolated to some extent, if possible, to mitigate these possible problems.
Your point about trying to figure out how dragons reproduce, I was going to say that was kind of a part of the Jurassic Park plots. Is like, it just goes to show you that they thought the scientists were so smart and they did all their work to make all the dinosaurs that they had cloned and created one gender. But as Ian Malcolm said, life finds a way, and then you had them spontaneously changing sexes so that they could reproduce. And, we don't know enough about dragon biology to speculate, but it would be interesting to see if a show that's very low tech in comparison to cloning and sci-fi and that kind of thing also had a similar take on trying to control that which is uncontrollable.
Yeah, I like the idea of little baby dragons, though I guess that's because I'm watching the show and not living there. Because, baby dragons might scare the crap out of me, right?
Yep.
I just think it's really neat the way that, cool, there's dragons, but there is... Myth Adventures is the late great Robert Asprin wrote some books, and Skeeve, his hero, ended up winning a dragon in some way, and his pet dragon is, very loyal and helpful, and it's his friend, as we talked about, these are not peach dragons. These are incredibly violent, uncontrollable beasts, and I'm fascinated where they're going to go with this.
Yeah, I think right now my ideal scenario would be for Daenerys to lead the three dragons into a battle against the White Walkers, sort of like on a kamikaze run to try to wipe out the leaders of that group, and out of that kind of conflagration would come maybe the next set of eggs that would be lying dormant until they were needed generations from now.
Oh, I like that. So they're going to get put in the big warehouse with the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Pull
That's
tab.
right.
Pull tab here and emergency.
That's right.
Warehouse 2, I guess, right?
Right beside the Royal Grenade.
Yes. It's in Warehouse 14. They're in Warehouse 14. Don't worry about it. The other thing that they pointed out, which because I haven't read the book, so I don't know if this will pop into y'all's head who's read some of them, but apparently George R.R. Martin points out in an acknowledgement in one of the books that he thanks someone for convincing him to put in the dragons. So according to our historians, that's another clue that the dragons weren't intended in the first place, that this really is the story about the War of Succession and magic as a tool. It's not the central story, which I thought was really interesting. And I guess I have a question for the book readers, too, because I've only read book 1, and you don't have much dragons in book 1. Doing anything. How are the presence of the dragons more relative to what we've seen on TV, or is it about the same, where they're kind of in the background and not really this sort of hovering presence?
Season 1 is very faithful to how that's portrayed, because it wasn't like he wasn't going to have supernatural at all, because the opening scene of the book, and when you as a reader, you don't know what's going on, but it turns out to be a Night's Watch encounter with a White Walker. And so obviously reanimated corpses or, ghost people or whatever the mystical, magical origin of the White Walkers is tied to, that he did intend to have some type of magical, otherworldly, fantasy, sci-fi-ish element in the books. But depending on which interview you read with him, he wasn't sure the dragons would be part of it. He wanted to establish that they were part of history and actually there. And that scene, I'm not sure which episode it's in, where Arya overhears the talking in the crypt. And she does see exactly what we saw in the show, which is like a fossilized head of a dragon down there. So in the world, they did exist at one point in time, and he was clear about that. But that acknowledgement and some of the things, he was convinced to make them come back at some point. But it was very faithful.
Okay, so the last one I want to talk about tonight is the video that speculates about Sansa. And this ties into some things we've talked about in the past about my hopes for Sansa, who is definitely going through, shall we say, trials, more so than anybody. And I loved how in this video, Itamar and Gil talk about how this notion that, Dany is going to get married to Jon Snow, or they're going to have an alliance. He's like, their argument is that's the Disney version of history. And they actually put forward a persuasive case, which I had actually seen after I had said I want Sansa to at least be the Wardeness of the North, if not sit on the Iron Throne, was that Sansa is sort of their person that they think is the likely person that will end up, partially because how you get to be sitting on that throne is not always a clear path, but also because of the inspiration of the War of the Roses. And, that's the rise of the Tudors, which is with a red-haired woman who marries no one. That's Queen Elizabeth I. She was a completely unlikely candidate at 17 to be the ruler. But there's a lot of parallels between Elizabeth and Sansa, besides red hair. She's the daughter of a traitor. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Her mother was executed, father executed. She gets help from other noble families. Elizabeth got help from Edward Seymour, and they had possibly some weird, creepy, maybe love connection. But the whole thing about Sansa, who she married, and actually this divergence that the show has now taken, but Sansa's now could potentially be a widow if we assume somehow Ramsay Bolton's going out of the picture. Her stock goes way up when she's a widow with, Wardeness of the North, widow. She becomes a prime person to form an alliance with down the road. And also that, their argument is you don't put people through all these trials if you're not eventually going to, make them show the medal that they've had to earn all the way along. So the idea that, it's going to be Jon Snow and Dany is kind of the Disney version is their argument. And as I talked about, Cersei's foreshadowing dream that a younger, more beautiful queen would take everything from her. They want to keep making us think it's Marjorie, but I still think it's Sansa. So lots of interesting theories, and also one that's different because of the changes in the books that they say strengthens their argument.
Yeah, it's and I wasn't sure what he was talking about because he was drawing a direct parallel with Elizabeth as a quote unquote virgin queen, whereas in the show, and if they are talking about the show, that's no longer the case with Sansa. Because of what happened on her wedding night with Ramsay. Now, you could make a case that, okay, by some technicality, could you still be considered a virgin queen if you were taken against your will? And then that gets into the whole question of consent, and that's an icky discussion to have. But I think he may have been just thinking of books Sansa at that point versus show Sansa. And it also, there are also parallels between, depending on what happens with the Faith Militant and the Faith of the Seven and the Church and King's Landing, a potential struggle with the church and recognizing legitimacy. Because if you wanted to be a ruler, say she wanted to marry somebody else, or if she just became a single queen like Elizabeth, she was married to Tyrion, but that wasn't consummated. So therefore she was free to marry Ramsay, and she did marry Ramsay, and that was consummated, depending on the question of consent and how the church would view that. But if he died and she's a widow, according to whoever's laws of succession use, she could marry again. So it raises all kinds of opportunities and possibilities for political intrigue between the church we all assume Ramsay's going to die, I think, so that she would be free to marry somebody else, or would she have to stay single and then take on a consort or a lover or an advisor? And what kind of people would be lining up for that position? There's lots of palace intrigue. And I liked your suggestion, Wendy. I remember when we were talking about episode 1 of this season and the prophecies of Maggie the Frog. What they want you to think, I think on the surface, and obviously because it's what drives Cersei and what she thinks, is Marjorie. But then you automatically, because we know things that Cersei doesn't, and Cersei's dismissed them, is that it could be Dany. But then there's, like, you bring up an excellent point that Sansa is also beautiful and also has some legitimate political capital to spend, either as Wardeness of the North or the eldest of the Stark children, that kind of thing. So it's really, really intriguing.
I'm fascinated by Sansa's journey. In a lot of ways, I think she's had the most dramatic, storyline, where she has been, this dreamy little schoolgirl writing Joffrey on her slate with charcoal, right? Going, oh, Joffrey, he's so cute, and
on her trapper keeper. Yes,
and this having the rude awakening, and then learning to play the game. Joffrey is my lord and my king, and I love him dearly, or whatever. I can't do justice what she said every time, right? And to last season we got to see her live not for the first time, but actually control her fate. And it would be fascinating for her to be this key to however we rule, whether we do the Iron Throne or we come up with another kind of life, that as the only known surviving Stark, the oldest daughter, and just where she could be is really interesting. And I loved how they brought up these historical characters, right? That the reference. So great stuff.
Well, first we have to assume that she's still alive before we can continue with any other lines of thoughts.
Yes.
But
it's a snowbank.
Yes.
It's Chekhov's jump.
There's an airbag. I really did like the parallels that they came up with in this particular segment, though they call the Dany Jon Snow, the Disney storyline, I would call Sansa the Disney B storyline if she became the queen, because right now she's probably got the most hero monomyth arc out of any character in the show. I mean, she's come from a very naive person and grown and experienced loss, but has recovered. And I'll never forget the Sansa 2.0 moment when all of a sudden she just sort of put it into another gear rather magically. But I don't know if she's going to, George R. R. Martin, he better not be hearing this theory, because if he does, knowing him, he's probably going to end up having Arya kill Sansa or something like that.
I keep thinking that is what's going to happen, actually.
Oh, really?
Because
that's dark.
No, well, I mean, Arya is dark, right? I mean, Arya is going down a really dark path. And as far as she knows, the last time she saw Sansa, she was standing watching Joffrey order Ned to be beheaded. That's the last she knows about her. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think by the time, if she ever got to that point, I think it would be for more than that incident. She's obviously going to be going on I'm talking about Arya now, quite a journey to probably regain her sight and learn a lot of humility along the way. And I thought I was making a joke, actually, but now that you're kind of buying into that or worried about that possibly happening, Wendy, I could see George R. R. Martin setting up some sort of dynamic where Sansa becoming the heir apparent would be one of the worst things that could happen. I can't think of a one off the top of my head, but George likes dark, and this ascendancy of Sansa from this naive child to end up on the throne or whatever form of government they end up with at the end of the series, to me that seems pretty Disney, and I don't want to take that away from people like Jesse who are hoping for one good thing to come out of this series, but man, that seems like almost more of a Disney storyline than the other one that most people seem to want anyhow. But I did like the parallels, the fact that she's the father of a traitor and all that stuff. That's really cool. It's interesting. I wonder how, if she ever got to that point, how people would react. Like, since they've been so upset about a lot of the sexual stuff that's going on the show, if she's referred to the Virgin Queen, are they going to get it up in arms to that? Because what if it was a guy that never got married and it was the Virgin King? You would never hear somebody say the Virgin King. You would just get the Virgin Queen. So, but again, that's going to wade into waters that are beyond the scope of what we're talking about. So, it was a very interesting video, and I did really like the parallels that they came up with.
Well, the other one that I thought was interesting, and I thought it was actually the most plausible argument that was made, was why do you engage us with characters who go through suffering without there being some cathartic solution, right? That's just
because that's
just
life.
Sadism, right? that's just sadism, right? But we're not writing the autobiography. We're writing fiction, right? We're writing literature.
Well, and George has been breaking the rules all the way along.
And I agree, but I think that's a valid argument. He's got a lot of characters. You can't have them all die horribly and failed. Otherwise, then you're in some other sort of vicious cycle. But the other thing that they point out as part of her journey is her direwolf is killed, but she lives. And that they really emphasize that, Sansa's going it. She's the first one who loses her magical totem. And really her story is, how does she build her inner resources, and how can she do things, through her own agency? And she doesn't always succeed, but, she's stumbled, she's had setbacks, she's not through her own fault, particularly with the stuff that's happened with Ramsay Bolton. I think that the parallels with Elizabeth was not so much the virginity, but the never marrying and being a single ruler. because a lot of people don't think Queen Elizabeth I was a virgin. She just wasn't married. So the other part I'm wondering is if he did go to this sort of triumvirate idea, well, Tyrion's her first husband. So maybe you could get the second marriage annulled under, it was all done under false pretenses. She didn't know who this guy was, and he legitimately, maritably raped her, that maybe she can get her marriage to Tyrion reinstated, and they're two of the three legs in the table of the triumvirate too. So
now, Wendy, that sounds like something I'd be cheering for. I keep thinking, really, I do. I keep thinking that, yeah, because, she doesn't realize how good he was to her and, how sweet he was. And, they just get these two kids together.
Well, no, she did recognize it because the night that Ramsay questioned her, how come you didn't sleep with Tyrion? And she said Tyrion was honorable. Mm. So she did recognize his qualities.
Okay.
To some extent. I think in the book she's portrayed as not quite so understanding, if my understanding is correct about her book character being a little different.
She's a little more petulant on the page.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, she's a younger teenager on the page too, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I don't know if we saw all the videos from these guys, but I'm kind of surprised that and maybe they didn't. I just haven't seen that one. Is they never really talk about the sparrows, because that's a big problem. Like, you've got all these religious fanatics that now are able to take up arms, and I don't know how anybody's going to be able to handle them, because they're probably one of the biggest forces in Westeros right now.
There actually are some videos about the religions. I actually shared the links in our last. No, that's not. I'm sorry, we have too many links. There's some other links that talk about the religions, and the faith of the seven. And in one of the other videos, though, I think it's the season 5 wrap-up video, which I think what we might be discussing maybe next week. It's the one called Season 5 Politics, but it's the one they did at the end. They talk about the problem with, I'll say outsourcing the military to this faction to some extent. But there's definitely more videos than are in here. Okay. And there's going to be more continuing. Since we started looking at these, there was just one that came out about Hodor, which I highly recommend.
Was that a one-word video?
It's a little bit shorter, but there's some bold Hodor predictions. It's actually Hodor? It's actually very well delivered and very amusing.
Yeah. So is there Khan one? I like that one too. Khan.
Yeah, the whole thing about the Dothrakis as compared to the Mongols is pretty interesting. So is there anything you guys have before we wrap up for today?
No. Good.
No, those are good videos. So, I was a little skeptical at first, like, how are they going to is it going to be too dry, talking about history and how many parallels can they make? But I was really surprised at their insight. And not only that, but they have a very entertaining and engaging delivery. So, and they don't take that long to watch. Oh. So I would highly encourage listeners to go check them out.
Yeah, and I really like how the host, and I don't know the names well enough to do, but calls his friend the biblical scholar, like, okay, what's your prediction? It really is kind of all right, you got to put it down, and not, he kind of calls him out and doesn't let him be wishy-washy, and I think that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Yes.
They have a very dry sense of humor. I like them quite a bit.
It's like a good talk show, like Westeros Tonight or something.
Yeah, it takes a while to get used to them, but once you watch an episode or two.
Before we go, we are going to do one more show to talk about a couple more videos that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but Christine couldn't be here tonight. particularly wanted to be on the conversation with those.
So, Wendy, I'm sorry. I know I'm not supposed to interrupt, but we have said we're going to do one more show about 3 times.
I know.
So at this point, let's just we are going to stick with us. We are going to get you to the season premiere. We may take a month off, right?
One
more show.
Right. So if you keep sending listener feedback and questions, we'll keep talking about it. But also on the blog post for last week's episode, there's a poll asking if you'd be interested in listening to us talk about season 1, doing a rewatch of it, because we didn't actually start the original Game of Thrones podcast until season 1 had completed. So this time we'd go back and watch each episode. And I think it'd be kind of cool to go back to season 1 at this point and take a fresh look and see how many things that maybe the first time I watched season 1, I was sort of waiting for something to happen and I wasn't necessarily paying attention to all the seeds that were being planted that paid off later. So that's a question for the listeners. If not, then we might take a little bit of a break before we come back and probably do some pregame shows, as well as talk about the DVDs when they come out. Although the DVDs are coming out really late, but the digital downloads are coming out very soon, which includes all the bonus features, I believe. So we might jump in on the digital version early. So definitely send your comments and thoughts. We appreciate it. And like I said, we will have another show talking more about some other topics that Gil and Itamar, the Game of Thrones Academy, tackle. In the meantime, go ahead and watch some of them. They're very entertaining, and they're probably 8 to 10 minutes long. The Hodor one is more like 3 minutes long. But as usual, I want to thank everyone for listening to the show and thank my small council members, Shannon, Jesse, and Lou. And Christine will be back next week, and we will see you again soon.
Bye.
Thanks for listening,
Bye.
everybody.
We love to get your feedback. Call us at 206-202-4182 or leave us a Skype voicemail to our Tuning Into Sci-Fi TV name. We have many ways to keep the discussion going on our blog. Drop by tuningintoscifitv.com and leave a comment. On the blog, you'll also find links to the forum discussions and other links to follow our Twitter and RSS feeds and find our Facebook account.
Listen to Tuning Into Sci-Fi TV on Stitcher Radio On Demand. Download the free app today at Stitcher.com. You've been listening to a Game of Thrones special from Tuning Into Sci-Fi TV, Episode 52, recorded August 4th, 2015.